We begin with an unbelievable story out of Pakistan, where 141 people are dead, including 132 children. The attack happened in the Peshawar area at a Pakistan-run military school. A Taliban group who has for years wanted to overthrow the government of Pakistan is believed to be responsible. Hospitals say that among the dead and wounded are children between the ages of 10 and 20 years old. At least 6 militants entered that school wearing security uniforms before massacring, as I mentioned, 141 people, and over 100 others are wounded tonight. Students were shot. At one point, a suicide bomber detonated a bomb that killed a number of students, and one teacher was reportedly set on fire and burned to death in front of students. Here's how some of the students who survived that attack are recounting it.
They entered each classroom one after the other, firing at any staff and firing at the children. I think there are many casualties.
We saw our friends lying dead on the floor of corridors, some with 3, some with 4 bullet wounds. They were covered in blood.
Here to provide insight into today's attack and the overall situation in Pakistan is Michael Kugelman, a senior associate at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the horror of this attack. This is obviously one of the most brutal attacks we've seen in modern times, certainly in this region. Is that true, or are there other attacks that this would be comparable to?
No, unfortunately it is true, and that's saying a lot because Pakistan has seen so many horrific high-casualty attacks, including many that have targeted children. The fact that you had 500 people, mostly kids, taken hostage and more than a quarter of them executed, this is really unbelievable, perhaps unprecedented. I mean, schools have been targeted by the Taliban. There have been high-casualty attacks, but in terms of a high-casualty attack at a school along these lines, I think it's unprecedented.
On absolutely no level do I want to try to create justification for any of this, but I want to ask you about a couple things here, because the Taliban said that this massacre was a revenge attack following an army offensive against Islamic extremists in North Waziristan. In June, more than 60,000 people in that region were forced from their homes, including many women and children. They fled to safer areas in Pakistan and Afghanistan. That was a Pakistani government initiative. In addition to that, U.S. drones in the area have struck more than 50 times, killing hundreds of militants and civilians as well. The Taliban leader who issued a statement today said this. He said, "We selected the army school here for this attack because the government is targeting our families and our females, and we want them to feel the pain." This is clearly an issue of war. It's an issue of kind of an unprecedented form of war that we've seen kind of developing in the Middle East, because we have the U.S. obviously engaging in activities as well as the Pakistani government. Not to create justification, but is this something we might see again if this continues in northern Pakistan?
Unfortunately, I think we will see it again. I would argue that this offensive that you mentioned, this military offensive that Pakistan has been leading in North Waziristan, what's very interesting is that after it began in June, terrorist violence really was reduced a lot in Pakistan. It was relatively quiet. Some people thought that was a sign of a successful operation. Others, more cynical folks like myself, thought that really it was a case of the Taliban and other militants in North Waziristan having been displaced, perhaps some killed, but more of them being displaced, going into Afghanistan, going to other tribal areas of Pakistan, and needing time to regroup, reconnect with their contacts, key facilitators, funders, and that eventually there was an expectation on my part that the attacks would begin again once Pakistan was ready, once the Taliban was ready to do so. And I think we saw with the attack today that a new phase of the Taliban's campaign against the Pakistani state has essentially begun.
Is there any truth, and again, we're not creating justification, is there any truth to the statement about women and children being targeted through these offensive by the Pakistani government or by U.S. drone strikes, which, as we know, are very unreliable when it comes to killing militants?
Yeah, the answer to the question is it's hard to say. I mean, the Pakistani military is always very opaque about what it's doing in the tribal areas, including in this military offensive. It's talked about all these huge achievements in terms of killing all these militants and so forth, but we don't really know the humanitarian side. And unfortunately, the Pakistani military does not have a good reputation in terms of being sparing and discreet in terms of how it deals with civilians. And the drone strikes is a whole other story. Certainly, drone strikes have killed civilians. But I think you have to look at this specific attack in terms of what the Taliban said after it was attacked. And the Taliban said it was in revenge for the Pakistani military offensive. It didn't say anything about drones. It has blamed drones for its attacks in the past, which I think is ridiculous. But in this particular case was meant to send a very strong message to the Pakistani army.
Specifically to the Pakistani army and Pakistani government. Financial Times is reporting about the cost of the Afghanistan war. It's just now reached just under $1 trillion for that particular war, with several hundred billion more still to be spent even after the war reportedly ends at the end of this month. But the Financial Times writes this: around 80% of that spending on the Afghanistan conflict has taken place during the presidency of Barack Obama, who sharply increased the U.S. military presence in the country after taking office in 2009. That does not include spending, as we were talking about, on drone strikes in Pakistan. Does this not indicate, though, to people that the strategy that we have undertaken over the last decade plus in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan, a nation with whom we've never really officially been at war, is not yielding the results that at least the military-industrial complex would like us to believe that it's going to yield?
Oh, absolutely. Well, when something costs $1 trillion, it better bring really good results. And clearly, things have changed in Afghanistan in the sense that you don't have the Taliban in power anymore. Women's rights have improved, education, healthcare, that type of thing has improved. But let's face it, you've got a very strong insurgency, as we've seen in terms of just in the last few weeks, attacks in Kabul have ramped up significantly. In Pakistan, the terrorism problem obviously has not been solved. Not that military force and a lot of money can do it. It needs to go way beyond that. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the numbers, the amount of money that the U.S., along with its allies, have put out there in Afghanistan, it's a huge amount. And certainly the results, the yields have not been there.
This goes back to the statement you made previously. In addition, when we're talking about this Pakistani offensive in Waziristan, you essentially had Taliban fighters who were displaced and disappeared, and that looked like victory, but it wasn't. It was just merely a time of waiting out and regrouping. In terms of Afghanistan, obviously the U.S. government plans to stick around for a long time. We've got 10,000 troops who are going to stay there, it looks like, for at least another decade. But at some point, that $1 trillion does not really seem to yield anything in terms of those who would just wait us out. Is this story today a microcosm of a bigger issue that ultimately for the United States in leaving Afghanistan, because at some point you think we've got to leave, that these guys are still just kind of biding their time?
Yeah, absolutely, and it goes to the the famous statement that the U.S. is very good at starting wars, but it's very bad at ending them. And certainly, it accomplished its chief objectives in Afghanistan. It removed the Taliban from power, and it really it destroyed the haven that al-Qaeda enjoyed in Afghanistan. But that's it. I mean, there are other factors that are still at play. It's an extremely unstable part of the world. Afghanistan and Pakistan are still dealing with these militancy issues. And just to clarify, the U.S., Barack Obama claims that he'll bring down those 10,000 troops to nearly zero by 2016. But of course, things could change if there's a new president who has other ideas. But absolutely, the commitment will remain there, even if more modest. And yet the question is, what has the return been? That's
true. And President Obama says that he's going to bring that number down, and yet he just signed an agreement to begin nighttime raids again in Afghanistan. Right. So Michael Kugelman, a senior associate at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.